So, for example, if you listen when the horns first come in, if you listen really carefully, you'll hear they're slightly out of tune, slightly. It's a little bit out of tune, not crazy. And I could have sent it back and been like, okay, the intonation's a little bit off. Is there? I'm like, let's get that. Let's get it. Let's do it. We don't need surgical, precise jazz, and
No,
jazz is not supposed to be surgically precise. It's jazz. Do you know where the word jazz actually comes from? Younger people will not know this, where the
no, no.
word
I
comes
do
from, but
tell.
yeah, it comes from New Orleans, or New Orleans, as people who are not from Nolans will say. But there were marching bands, brass bands, right? And this is a very popular style of music back, and by the way, ragtime music was literally the adaptation of the marching band music for lounge, and if you're in a bar and you wanted to hear your favorite marching band song.
Wow.
After they would march through the streets. Maybe they had a gig, they did a funeral, or, maybe they did a wedding, or whatever
The,
they're
the
doing,
same the same music for the wedding and the funeral, by the way.
probably, yeah.
Yeah.
But after, they would either have a rehearsal or a concert. Some people after the rehearsal would say, "Hey man, you want to just stick around? Maybe we'll just jazz around a bit." Jazz, it was JASS, which then ultimately, and it just jazz meant playing about, messing around, improvising, just having fun, just making music for the sake of making music. And they called it jazz, jazzing around. And then eventually this evolved into the word jazz. So, I didn't want to fix the intonation problems. A little out of tune? Great. Throw it in the mix, stir the pot. Let's go.
What David and the band caught is all that spicy mix that makes up the Great American Songbook and big band jazz. So it's blues, as David said. It's New Orleans marching band music. It's jazz. It's orchestral music, and it's English lyric poetry, of the Romantic poets. So the rhyming couplets, the internal rhymes, the elegant wordplay, the irony, all of that together makes the Great American Songbook, and this an eternal, enduring form of music. Now, again, we take this classic sound and we create something new because our players are young and they interpret in their own way. So that's one of the great joys for me, springing into the future. So Marco may not know all this history, but he feels it and he plays
He
it. And
feels it.
same with Davide. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's funny because, not funny, but, for young listeners that may not know, but, that's where the word jazz evolves from. But the jazz music, as it were, if you study, the history of jazz, usually most people will credit it to three distinct sources. One is the marching band. As I mentioned, ragtime music was the adaptation of the marching band music to a saloon or tavern setting. So, one person band. And then the third thing that it is attributed to is blues. So it's those three distinct styles that really went into making jazz. And for anybody who's interested, there's a jazz pianist who, came out of the ragtime tradition, and his name was Fats Waller. And he's one of the most important figures in jazz
Yeah.
because he's the one from which the word swing, we
Mhm.
in other words, he was doing very rigid, straight, non-swing ragtime. And then eventually, over the period of, I don't know, like 3 or 5 years or so, if you listen to his recordings, you can track and hear he's starting off with the straight, and then by 5 years later, it's swing, like actual what we call swing. And it's just fast. The history of jazz is really quite incredible for those who have not sort of looked into it. Anyway, all that to say, if anyone is interested, about the relationship and evolution from ragtime to swing, Fats Waller, check him out.
If I could add, the great American documentary maker Ken Burns
Mm.
has a series called Jazz. I think it's 10 or 12 episodes, and it's just fantastic. So check that out as well. It's the source of all of today's music, including hip hop and rap and future directions. It's really a
Mhm.
wonderful story.
It is. It is. It's incredible because all this music came about at the, from the 1800s to the 1900s, and it began with slave songs. So the slaves in America, to sort of pass the time and do this horrible, horrible labor, they would sing in the fields, and there was a very distinct style that arose called the spiritual. And this was the very first form of African American music. Then you go to the Mississippi Delta, which we talked about on another podcast, and then you get this harsh working environment, which gave birth to the blues. Then you have Nolans, and you have the marching band and the ragtime music and Scott Joplin, and you know, and then it all gets thrown together, and you get jazz, and then from jazz, we got rock and roll, soul, gospel, and then all the way up to R&B, hip hop, modern day Motown. You throw it's all comes from that, and it's I like to think of it as just truly uniquely American music. Regardless. I mean, it begins with the the African American slaves. It begins there, but then it just evolved, man. It
Yeah.
just evolved.
And as always, our band is about taking these wonderful forms from the past, the genres, and springing into the future.